All right, Fiberistas, welcome. Let me make sure that I have all the sound turned off on everything. Otherwise, we're going to get this weird echo. Welcome, and I'm so glad that you guys can join me today. I know that a lot of people in the United States are watching some testimony that's happening on television. So I'm grateful for those that are joining me, especially Robin and Joanne and Shelly and Kathy. Hi, I'm so glad you guys are here. All right, so and I always do this. I always forget who asked me these questions, and it's. I apologize because I'm keeping track of email and comments on all these different places, and so a lot of times I lose track of the questions. But this question came across somewhere from somebody about wet finishing art weaving, and I wanted to talk about that because that's a really important question. And I get that question a lot, and I do need to address it because, to be perfectly honest, wet finishing for art weaving is way different than wet finishing that you might do for traditional weaving, or even, that kind of blocking that you might do for knitting or crochet or stuff like that. All right, so I'm going to talk about that for a little bit. Now, first, if you're not familiar, wet finishing in general, and we're talking traditional weaving, and you probably know about blocking. When you are done with a hand knit or a hand woven piece, a lot of times, and this is with the exception, it was Shelly. Okay, Shelly, yes. All right, so glad it was a really good question. All right. So what happens when you wet finish like traditional weaving, and even with knitting, the yarn, when you're working with it, the yarn is kind of in this place. But when you are done, when you introduce water into the fiber kind of blooms. And a lot of the stitches and the weaving, the fabric will kind of bloom into a little more of a cohesive fabric. So a lot of times in traditional weaving, the yarns are going to kind of meld together just a little bit. Now, a lot of times people will scour their fabric, and that really, really kind of loosens up those fibers and really helps it bloom into a nice, tight, solid fabric. It's also a nice way to kind of lock in any ends that you may have woven in and stuff like that. So generally that's the way that you finish, traditional fiber art. Either you're going to block your knitting or crochet, and what that's also going to do is that's going to even up your stitches, and you're going to be able to make sure that if you're doing like a fitted sweater or something, that those pieces are the right size that they need to be. Well, it's similar with weaving. The fabric kind of ends up becoming what it's meant to become by the fibers blooming, and off the loom it has a chance to relax a little bit, and the finishing just kind of tightens that up. Now, the difference being, when you're doing art weaving, there's a lot that goes, there's a lot of different fibers going on in your art weaving, and sometimes the fabric that's being woven is a lot more delicate. So that being said, there's a lot of things to take into consideration when you're doing a kind of wet finish on your work. And that being said, a lot of times with art weaving, you don't even necessarily need to wet finish it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. All right, so I like to think, and I keep finding myself coming back to this, and particularly if you're doing any weaving with art yarn warps, and where the weft is like a really delicate lace weight stuff, even though the warp is pretty sturdy, I would definitely consider art weaving more like you would consider like a hand knit lace scarf or shawl, where it's going to be a little more delicate than you think. So that being said, when you're doing any kind of finishing, I would kind of take that into consideration. It's going to be a little bit more fragile. And when you're wet finishing any kind of freeform art weaving type of stuff, like with, something like this, right? I'm taking, there's all kinds of yarns in here. I mean, a lot of it, this piece particularly looks like there's a bunch of hand spun and there's a bunch of sock yarn. So there's if I were to take each individual yarn and launder it on in by itself, the treatment of each yarn would be a little different, and you kind of have to take that into consideration when you're doing any kind of wet finishing. So a lot of times what I would do is, when I'm looking at this piece here, I'm going to look at the more delicate fibers, and for me it's things like this lock structure. If I were to do any kind of heavy scoury type of stuff, it would really mess up this lock structure, and I definitely don't want to do that. Same with this kind of wispier locks here. Even the sari ribbon, let me tell you, sari ribbon tends to be way more fragile than you would think. The silk, it's also been shredded a little bit, and sometimes, you know, it's older saris, so there's a little wear on this sari. So I think you kind of have to take those fibers into consideration, and I would launder your piece accordingly. All right, I have to check my notes. All right. So that being said, some other things you might want to check out, like I said, locks, hand spun yarn. If you are doing a piece, let me see, right here I've got, now this piece here is, there's a good bit of hand spun here. And there's also this mohair. This mohair, if you're going to do any kind of agitation, it's already kind of felting a little together, and that probably has to do more with just the movement of the piece in general. So yeah, and if you're not familiar, the things that cause felting in general are pH, which if it leans more towards the basic instead of acidic, I always get confused as to number-wise what that is. Base will cause felting, agitation, and changes in temperature. That being said, I mean, you could put things into a lot of hot water and soak things in hot water, but if there's a shock immediately to cold, then that's what's going to cause things to felt. But I've washed locks in hot water and boiling water, and it's been fine. It's just a matter of having to bring that temperature up slowly. All right, so things like hand spun, hand dyed, you might consider, because sometimes hand dyed, even though a lot of dyers take the steps to make it light and wash fast, sometimes you might get some leftover dye that's going to come out of that fiber. So you have to kind of take that into consideration. And anything non-superwash, just straight up. I mean, like I said, you know, this is a commercial yarn, but it's a mohair, so it's definitely not superwash. You know, and even this hand spun, I have a bunch of different fibers in it, but for the most part, it's going to be wool, that processed farm wools. All right, so the different ways that you can wet finish, and you can, like, you could straight up, you could wet finish, like this piece. Okay, so this is mostly sock yarns. It's a pretty solid fabric. Now I would have wet finished it before I put the embellishments on it, but you could, I mean, I could, and I don't know that I did, but there wouldn't be anything wrong with doing a traditional wet finish where I put it in a sink of hot water with some wool wash, and I scrunchie it a little bit and kind of agitate it just a little bit, let it sit there for about 20 minutes, rinse it in hot water, and then either spin it out in the washing machine. I mean, I wouldn't put it through a full cycle, just the spin to get the water out, and then hang it to dry. That's how I traditionally would do something like this. I think I also did that to, I want to say I did that to this piece. But you know what? I probably didn't do a lot of agitation because I do have these locks in here. But I do know that I did some form of wet finishing on this piece. And that's because the fabric, for the most part, is close to traditional fabric, even though I did use some different fibers. And you can even see, you know, here most of the fibers were non-wool. The warp in this part right here is I believe it's a rayon. But then there's sections where I did use some hand spun wool. And if you're looking really close, I don't know if you can tell on this piece as I'm holding it up, but this section here, I mean the sections around it where there was wool tightened up a little bit, so that you can see just a little bit of a, you know, of a, I don't know, wave right through here where the fabric's looser than it is where it tightened up with the wool. And I'm not necessarily sure I have a problem with that. But like I said, when I wet finished this piece, I didn't do a lot of agitation. I just did some gentle soaking with the wool wash, put it to spin it out to dry, and then hang it up. And it's mostly because I didn't want to mess with the lock structure. All right. So does that make sense? All right. There's also you could, like I said, I generally go for either hot or super warm water. I don't generally do things in cold, and that's mostly because most of what I work with is wool, and I just want to make sure that I'm not damaging the wool or the lock structure. I do use a lot of locks in my stuff. And I use a wool wash that's really specific to like hand knits and wools and yarns and stuff like that. Things like Euclan. Oh, gosh, I'll put a link in the show notes. Unicorn has a fabulous product. I like theirs. There's also Soak. Soak is a really good one. And Kookaburra, that's my new favorite. I love that one. I'll put links to those 4 different types of wool washes that I love. I know that there's some others probably out there. I think Natalie Redding has a wool wash that she's come up with. I haven't tried it, but I'm sure it's going to be fantastic because her family it's like a shampoo empire, so it makes sense that she would have an awesome wool wash. So yeah, I mean, but at the same time, you could also skip it. I don't think that that's a deal breaker. I mean, sometimes the wool wash, what it can do, especially if you have some hand spun, sometimes washing doing it with a little wool wash will get the last remnants of that lanolin if you didn't get it out in the first fiber run when you're washing the fiber. All right, let me show you some of these other pieces. This one I did the same where I didn't do a heavy agitation. Again, it was because I had, you know, some locks, but at the same time, you know, the fabric itself was relatively tight. So I wanted to make sure that, I mean, I did a little more of a regular wet finish, but not as much agitation, just because of the lock structure. Let's see if there's another one. This one I didn't. This one I didn't wet finish at all, and a lot of that had to do with I have some areas here where it has some open work. And I wanted to like not agitate with that open work. Here's some areas here where I have some wool, and it's the weave is a little looser. Let me I'm messing with my thing. Okay, where the weave is a little looser. So I think it looks like something's going on with my thing. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the weave is a little looser, and I just didn't want to mess with that. And I've got, you know, lots of danglies that have lock structure, and I just didn't want to mess with it. So I just left it. And this is even what I consider a wearable piece. So I just let it be, and it's really okay. It's okay that if you don't want to wet finish at all. Another time when I didn't wet finish, if you're in my, I think I just flashed my cleavage, sorry y'all. If you're in my Art Yarn Warps class, here's another piece I didn't wet finish, and it's because I have leather in here. I don't want to put that in water, and that's fine. I mean, and this is exactly a kind of piece that's okay that I didn't wet finish. There's nothing in here that I want to tighten up. Maybe this little section type here, and I think I have another one here. But honestly, it's okay that I didn't wet finish it, especially because I think wet finishing would compromise the leather in that piece. You know, same goes for, like I said, if you're working with, I have some seashells, even before I put the seashells on here. Sometimes the sari ribbon releases a lot of dye. There's a lot of dye doesn't strike on the sari ribbon, so every time I've gone to soak anything that had sari ribbon in it, a lot of dye would come out into that wash water. And a way to help that is if you there's a product on Dharma called Cifranol, and it helps isolate those dye particles and keep it from striking onto the rest of your stuff. Again, I'll put a link in the show notes on to that stuff. So, I mean, these are examples of just where you not necessarily don't have to really wet finish things. Or even if, like, this piece, I didn't wet finish this. This is definitely this is a wall hanging. There's just no need, and I just didn't want to compromise these locks here. So I don't think wet finishing for art weaving is a hard, fast rule. I think you can do it, and there's reasons why you might want to do it, but you also definitely want to approach it with a lot of caution and a lot of just treating things very gently, and just take into consideration the weave, how you're going to use it, and the fibers that are in it, and just kind of go accordingly. But if you have any doubts, then don't wet finish. I mean, I think that's perfectly fine not to do it with this kind of fabric. I think you'll be fine, and I think you definitely won't be sorry. But if you do wet finish something, and the chances are that you might get those locks to the structure to come undone, or if something, if a lacy open area just ends up not performing well because you wet finished it, I think you would be more sorry for having wet finished than you would have if you had just left it to be. Anyway, so those are my tips. I'm going to go back through and see if there's any questions. So, all right. Hi, Kathy from Connecticut, and Mary, and TJ, and Pat. All right. In most cases, people wash their hand spun after spinning 5. So, hasn't the yarn bloomed there? Would it continue the process in the wet finish after weaving? Yes, Mary. I think that what happens is, even though people have Dharma Synthropol. Yes, Robin, Dharma Synthropol. And Mary, to answer your question, yeah, I do believe that the yarn does bloom after you wash it when you hand spin, but the act of tightening things onto the loom and then weaving, what sometimes that happens is that when you take it off the loom and it relaxes, and then you turn around and wet finish, and this I'm talking like more with traditional weaving, I think. Well, not even necessarily, because this piece has a bunch of hand spun in it too. So when the tightness of the loom is going to stretch that wool again, and same with as you're working it and weaving. So when you take it off the loom, what it does is it helps it bloom back into place, but it also helps it bloom into the structure that you put it into as far as the weaving goes. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Anyway, but yeah, let me show you. In this particular section right here, is it this one? Yeah, right here. In this particular section, I have hand spun in both the warp and the weft. There we go. In both the warp and the weft. And doing some wet finishing, but without like a lot of agitation, kind of helped the fabric, and I don't know if you can see, the fabric kind of meld into each other a little bit. So, does that make sense? All right. Synthropol. And then, unfortunately, my internet in my garage where the dice things. I know, and my internet here, Robin, has been terrible. I'm hoping that I know Google Fiber is like somewhere in the general neighborhood, attempting to be in my entire neighborhood, and as soon as that happens, I think I'm switching over, because there's a lot of people plugged into my internet, and I think it's overtaxing the system, because my connections can be iffy sometimes. All right, so I'm going to check and see if there's any more questions, and I don't know that there are. Here we go. Mary wants to know, do you always have to block if you wet finish, or can you hang it, for instance, as if you would a shawl? Yeah, I totally would hang it. I would. If you wet finish your woven pieces, what I would do is once it comes out of the sink of water or whatever, if it's not too delicate, then go ahead and spin it out in your washing machine to get that excess water. Or if it's small enough, you could even do like a salad spinner. Or if not, don't be afraid to just hang it up sopping wet and just let it dry naturally. I know here in North Carolina in this heat it'll be dry in 20 minutes, but just let it hang out. What about color catcher, Stacy? I used one when dyeing. I have never used the color catcher as far as washing stuff in the sink, other than that Synthropol. The Synthropol kind of acts as like a color catcher, I believe. But it's like a detergent. It's a kind of detergent that they sell at Dharma Trading, and Dharma Trading is where I get my dye supplies. So it's kind of acts in that same way. So anyway, Namaste has wonderful. Yes, I'm wondering, Robin, and I'll look it up. I'll look up Natalie's wool wash, because I have no doubt her wool wash would be fabulous. I know that Natalie Redding as in Redding shampoo, so I have no doubt that they're going to have some excellent wool wash before dyeing as a fixative. That's interesting. A Synthropol before dyeing as a fixative. Can you agitate part of a piece? I imagine you could. Like if you, Robin, if you were if you had, let's say, let me look for an example. Okay, so let's say this piece, right? And if I wanted to, even if I wanted to go into this middle part, but I've got this. Okay, let's say that I wanted to try and do just this one area and not get the locks. You could always just put this into the sink and hold this area out and, wash that part. I guess there's ways that you could wash and agitate just parts of it. Just being mindful of what you don't want to wash. But like areas like between these two areas, locks, it might be a little iffy. I think this area where it's a little wider between the locks might be fine. And I could see where you would want to, because let's say that I wanted to play off the fact that I didn't use, wool in this one section, but I used wool on either side. So if I wanted to agitate to like shock this area and to where it would felt and shrink up a little bit, leaving a little more of a ruffly effect in this area. But it'd be hard. Like I said, if I've got locks on either side, but it might be fine if you don't have locks. Do you always have to wet finish in warm water? I usually do, Pat. I usually do wet finish in warm water, mostly because any felting that I've ever had done has always happened with cold water. And warm water usually kind of prevents the felting a little bit. I know that mostly what causes felting is actually extreme temperatures changes. So But I haven't really had problems with felting. If, even just like dyeing, I'll, get the water to where it's a little simmering and put the wool in and it doesn't felt. It's just that if I were to shock it and put some cold water in there, that it would felt. So I usually just try to use warm water to keep it from felting. And also too, warm water, it kind of opens up that shingle a little bit. Because with wool, with the shingles, the warm water is going to make it open up, as would soap. Soap, the alkaline makes the shingle open up a little bit. It's that if you shock it, and the shingle closes, that's when you start to get the felting. So I would either use warm water and then let it, gradually come down, and that's going to prevent it from, like, locking together, if that makes sense. All right. Any more questions? Before the dyeing is a fixative. Always lock what finish, or can you hang it, for instance, if you had a shawl? Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think I'm going to sign off. Anyway, just a reminder, this is the last week to sign up for the Beyond the Basics. That's going to close next Wednesday on the 31st. And again, if you signed up for Beyond the Basics, you get all the series classes that I'm releasing throughout the year, and that's going to include the 3 that are already released and the other 7 that's coming. And I have a list of what those are on the landing page. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to that, as well as Clasped Wefts class. That's so hard to say. Clasped Wefts class is open for pre-registration. That opened on Friday, and that's going to go live on August 2nd. So if you just want to get the classes individually, that one's available. But of course, if you sign up for the Beyond the Basics, you'll get free access to that class. All right. So if that's all, wait, hold on. There's one more question. Could you use tie-dye technique to protect the locks? That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think even if you tied off the locks, like even if you tied it off underneath some plastic or something, if you tied it off underneath some plastic, maybe, because it would prevent the water and some of the agitation getting to that. But I'm wondering if where you tied off would turn into like a 3-dimensional shibori type thing where you'd get this nipple looking thing by your lock. So that's a good question. That would be worth doing a little experiment. I mean, it could be interesting. So I don't know. All right. Thanks so much for the information. You're welcome. Robin, okay, so you have another question? Robin, I'm going to wait. I'm waiting to see. I think, Robin, do you have another question? And I'll hold on and wait for a minute. Oh, there we go. Wait. Yes, thanks, but it's a good prep. Work on fixing the dye. Yeah, Kathy, that makes sense that you would use that detergent as a wetting agent, because then that way it breaks the surface tension of the water within the fiber, so that way that the dye would go into the fiber a little more. And that's what I've done similar, but not with I can never say that, synthropol. I've done it with just regular soap, like even like Dawn dish liquid. Just a touch of that in the dye. It helps the dye strike to the surface a little better. So that I can understand why you would use it as a conditioner beforehand. Can you do something on drum carding? I certainly can. And I tell you what, if you want to drum carding as far as making art bats, I know I do have one video on that where I drum carded an art bat, and I also have a video on using a blending board for art bats. Always any way to get a rain check on the Beyond the Basics. The Beyond the Basics closes on the 31st. So if you can get to it by next Wednesday at midnight, that'd be great. So, but I tell you, if you sign up for it, it's not like a. I mean, the classes will be there available for you to look at anytime. So, so that's two more what? Two more. I'm not sure what you mean by two more. Anyway, but yes, the Beyond the Basics needs to close on the 31st, but it's at midnight. But the classes though are there to watch anytime. So, drum card. So that's were your two questions. Okay. So yeah, and the drum carding, we could totally do a drum carding. It might be later though. I'll have to pull together some stuff for drum carding, but I will post in the show notes the two carding videos that I have. I did an hour-long demonstration on the blending board, which is similar, and then I did do a drum carding lesson. But that wasn't a live cast. That was like an outright video on spinning an art yarn, and I did a video on drum carding, and I'll post that in the show notes. Happy belated birthday. Thank you. Are there any classes not included in your Beyond the Basics group? Yes, there will be. If I do any spinning classes, those won't be included. There's an art mentorship that's going to be coming. It's probably going to be, if not late fall, it might be at the beginning of next year, where it's where I help you guys take your art to whatever level you want it to be. And that's going to be a monthly membership. That will not be a Beyond the Basics class. There's also two classes. I have an art journaling challenge that I used to do. I'm trying to decide if that's going to be part of the art mentorship or separate or both. And as well as I have a class on really simple garment construction method that you can use with weaving, crochet, knitting. That's going to blow your mind. That's another class that I have to pull together. But right now, pulling together the Beyond the Basics classes, because it's, I wanted to get that Beyond the Basics fleshed out. When I put that class together originally, I had the content, but I knew that there was more information I could be sharing. But as I started to build that, it made more sense to break those up into individual classes. So all the Beyond the Basics classes are actually based off of the lessons in Beyond the Basics. So that's what I'm doing, is going back to flesh out that information. And then once I'm done with that, I have other classes that aren't in the Beyond the Basics. All right. You need drum carding troubleshooting. Robin, if you're in the collective, if you want to post a question there, then as far as troubleshooting it, and actually you might be able to if you post something in there, there's like tons of people that will also offer information as well. But yeah, any troubleshooting drum carding. Yeah, I mean, if you want to post what you're having trouble with as far as drum carding, and if you have any pictures of what you're getting that you're not happy with, then the collective is a really, really, really good place to post that. All right. Are there any other questions? I'm going to give it a minute. Okay. I think that might be it. All right. But if you have any questions and I'm missing here, then hit me up in the comments, shoot me an email, or ask in the collective. The collective is a really great place. If you guys aren't a part of the Fiber Art Collective, sign up. I mean, it's not only is it like such an inspiring place to share work and see what other people are doing and get encouragement. There's a huge brain trust in that collective. So if you have any questions, I learn things in there all the time. So, all right, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for joining, and I will talk to you guys next week.